garden the rain, and the man who rested. There is a particular kind of afternoon that exists only in the middle of summer, when the heat has been present for so many weeks that the world seems to have forgotten there was ever anything else. The air sits heavy and still. The insects grow lazy. Even the wind, which is usually so restless, so eager to move from one place to the next, seems to have given up, settled somewhere invisible, and decided to simply breathe instead of blow. It was on exactly such an afternoon that Akinosuke sat in his garden. He was not doing anything remarkable. He was not reading, nor writing, nor tending to the plants that grew in quiet abundance around him. He was not thinking about the past, at least not with any urgency, and he was not making plans for the future. He was simply sitting, his back against the great, ancient trunk of the camphor tree that had stood in the corner of his garden for longer than anyone in the village could remember. His legs folded loosely beneath him, his hands resting open in his lap, like two small bowls waiting to be filled with something they could not yet name. To look at him from a distance, you might have thought he was a statue, or perhaps a monk who had discovered that the most sacred thing a person can do is absolutely nothing at all. His name was Akinosuke. That much was certain. Everything else about him was quieter, harder to pin down. He was not a young man. His hair had begun its slow retreat from black into silver at the temples, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that came not from squinting or from worry, but simply from having lived long enough to have smiled many times, and to have looked into the distance many times, and to have sat in the rain on a great many evenings just like this one was about to become. But he was not old either, not in the way that the word old is usually meant, not diminished, not emptied, not in the slow retreat from the world that age sometimes brings. He was somewhere in that vast, uncharted country that lies between youth and age, a country that has no name, and that most people pass through without ever fully stopping to look around. He had lived in this village at the edge of the cedar forest for more years than he liked to count. He had a house that was modest and well kept, with sliding screens that let in the morning light in long gold rectangles, and a stone path that wound from the gate through the garden to the front door in a gentle curve, as if the path itself could not quite bear to arrive too quickly. He had a few neighbors who respected him in the easy, uncomplicated way that communities sometimes respect those among them who are consistently gentle. He had a small vegetable garden to one side of the house, and a larger wilder garden, more of a cultivated wilderness, really, that he tended with the kind of attention that looks from the outside like inattention, but is in fact the deepest kind of care, the kind that knows when to act and when to leave well enough alone. And in the corner of that garden stood the camphor tree. It was enormous, trunk was wider than two men standing side by side with their arms spread, and its bark had the deeply grooved, almost geological texture of something that has been alive long enough to have developed its own topography, its own ridges and valleys and mysterious indentations that the eye could follow the way a traveler follows mountain ranges on a map. Its roots surfaced from the earth in great, arching waves before plunging back down again, creating hollows in the soil where moss grew in soft, impossibly green patches, and where small things, beetles, spiders, the occasional frog, made their patient and purposeful lives. The canopy of the tree spread outward and upward in every direction, covering a vast circle of ground in shifting, layered shade. In spring, new leaves came in a pale, luminous green that seemed almost lit from within. In autumn, they turned slowly to gold before letting go. In this afternoon, they were at their deepest and most complex. A dark, glossy, multitonal green that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, so that sitting beneath the tree felt like sitting at the bottom of a slow, benevolent sea. Akinosuke had sat beneath this tree many times. He had sat here in the mornings when the light came slantwise through the leaves, and the birds were still deciding what kind of day it would be. He had sat here in the evenings when the shadows pooled and the sky above the canopy turned through its sequence of colors with the unhurried deliberateness of something that has been doing this for an eternity and sees no reason to rush. He had sat here in winter when the bare branches made their stark, elegant calligraphy against a white sky, and the cold had a clarity and honesty to it that he had always found bracing rather than harsh. But there was something about summer afternoons beneath this tree that was different from all the other times. There was a quality to the light and the heat and the particular heaviness of the air that made the boundary between waking and sleeping, between thinking and simply being, more permeable than usual, as if the tree itself, in the deep fullness of its summer abundance, was exhaling something, some compound of warmth and shade, and the faint, complex fragrance of camphor that gently loosened the knot that keeps a person tethered to the ordinary, waking world. On this particular afternoon, Akinosuke had come to the garden after a simple lunch, rice, pickled vegetables, a small piece of grilled fish that his neighbor had left at his gate that morning as a gesture of uncomplicated kindness, and had settled himself against the tree without any particular intention beyond being there. He had brought no book, no task, no agenda. He had brought only himself, which is sometimes the most generous and courageous thing a person can offer to a moment. The village beyond his garden gate was quiet. The few sounds that reached him, the distant sound of someone's hammer, the cry of a bird somewhere in the direction of the forest, The occasional murmur of a passing conversation arrived already softened by distance, already half transformed into texture rather than meaning. They did not intrude. They were more like the sounds in a painting of a village than sounds in an actual one. For a while, he simply breathed. This is rarer than it sounds. Most people, when they sit down and close their eyes and tell themselves they are resting, are in fact engaged in an extraordinary amount of invisible labor. They are reviewing conversations from last week. They are rehearsing conversations they plan to have next week. They are making lists, revising lists, worrying about things on the list that they have been worrying about. For so long, the worry has become a kind of companion they would not know how to live without. They are doing the endless, exhausting, mostly invisible work of being a self, of maintaining the story of who they are, what they want, what they fear, what they have done, and what has been done to them. Akinosuke, in that hour beneath the camphor tree, was doing none of these things. Perhaps this was a practice he had cultivated over many years. Perhaps it was simply the particular grace of that afternoon. The heat, the shade, the camphor fragrance, the slowness of a summer that had decided it had nowhere to be. Perhaps it was the tree itself, with its immense, patient, arboreal consciousness, pressing gently against his back, reminding him without words that it was possible to exist on this earth for a very long time without needing to be anywhere other than exactly here. Whatever the reason, Akinosuke was simply present. And in that simplicity, he was more fully alive than he had been in weeks. Then slowly, so slowly that it was impossible to say precisely when it began, the sky began to change. He noticed it first not with his eyes, but with his skin. A coolness arrived in the air, delicate as a whisper, the very first softening of the afternoon heat. Then the light shifted, not dramatically, not the sudden curtaining of a storm, but a gentle, gradual deepening, as if the sky were slowly putting on its dusk clothes several hours early, exchanging the hard brightness of full summer afternoon for something more muted, more intimate, more the color of thought than the color of action. He opened his eyes and looked up through the layered canopy of the camphor tree, in the spaces between leaves where sky was visible. He could see that the blue had been replaced, wholly and seamlessly, as though the sky had simply changed its mind, with a gray. But not a harsh gray, not the bruised, vaguely threatening gray of a storm that intends violence. This was a softer gray, a pewter gray, the gray of old silk or of river mist in early autumn. It was the gray of something that asks rather than demands. And then the first drop of rain fell. It landed on a leaf directly above him. He heard it before he felt anything. A small, precise, musical tap against the glossy surface of the leaf. Then another drop on a different leaf, a slightly different pitch. Then another, and another, each one its own small note, its own small percussion, until within a minute or two, the entire canopy had become a kind of instrument, the rain playing it with thousands of light fingers, producing a sound so complex and so beautiful that it seemed less like weather and more like a piece of music that had been composed for this exact garden, for this exact tree, for this exact afternoon. Akinosuke did not move. He had never been one of those people who scramble for shelter at the first sign of rain, pulling coats over heads and making theatrical runs for doorways as though rain were a catastrophe rather than a gift. He had always understood, in some deep and unspoken part of himself, that rain is simply the sky being generous. He had always found in it a particular comfort that he could not entirely explain. Something about the sound, perhaps, the way it wraps around a person like a sound-made blanket, canceling out the harsher frequencies of the world and replacing them with this one sustained, gentle, multi-textured white. Or perhaps it was the smell, that first, unmistakable fragrance of rain meeting dry earth, which is one of the oldest and most universally beloved smells in the human catalog. A smell so ancient that it is less perceived than remembered, less smelled than recognized, like the smell of a home one lived in before one had the language to describe homes. The camphor tree above him kept most of the rain from reaching him directly. A few drops made it through, landing on his hand, on his knee, on his upturned face when he lifted it to look cool and precise and welcome. But mostly he was sheltered, existing in a dry space at the center of the rain's sound, the way the eye of something exists at the center of its own turning. He let his eyes close again. The sound of rain on leaves is one of the most ancient lullabies in the world. It predates every lullaby that has ever been sung by a human throat to a human child. It is the lullaby that the earth has been singing to its creatures since the first rain fell on the first tree, and those creatures, curled in their burrows and their nests and their hollows, felt the sound come through the earth and the wood and the air around them and relaxed, knowing that this sound meant, you are sheltered, you are small, and the world is large, and you are sheltered within it. You do not need to do anything right now. You can simply be still. Akinosuke felt this. He felt it in the way his shoulders, which he had not known were tense, slowly descended from somewhere near his ears to somewhere nearer their natural position. He felt it in the way his breath, which he had not known was shallow, deepened without effort, became slower, became more like the breathing of someone who has been asleep for a while than someone who has just been trying to rest. He felt it in the way the thoughts that had been drifting through him, vague, unimportant, the mental equivalent of dust, motes in a sunlit room, began to slow and thin and drift further and further apart until the spaces between them grew too large to hold even the awareness that spaces were growing. The rain continued. The camphor tree continued its patient, generous sheltering. The fragrance of the tree mixed with the fragrance of rain on earth to create something new and nameless, some compound of green and water, and ancient wood and moss, and the very particular mineral smell of stone made wet, which is one of the smallest and purest pleasures available to a person in this world, somewhere in the distance. Or perhaps it was very close. Perhaps it was just beyond the edge of his hearing. Or perhaps it was closer than that. Perhaps it was inside the sound of the rain itself. There was a quality that was almost like music. Not a tune, not anything that could be transcribed or named. Simply a quality, a harmonic something that the rain was producing as it fell through the particular architecture of the camphor tree's branches and leaves, through the specific geometries of this garden, in this village, on this afternoon. Akinosuke heard it or felt it. The distinction was no longer entirely clear. His hands, which had been resting open in his lap, had relaxed further now, the fingers curling very slightly, the palms turning upward in the loose, trusting posture of hands in sleep. His head, which had been resting lightly against the tree trunk, grew heavier. The tree received this weight with complete and ancient equanimity, the way trees receive everything, without judgment, without impatience, with a steadiness that is less like endurance and more like simply having always been there. It would be wrong to say that Akinosuke fell asleep. Falling suggests a loss of control, a sudden absence of the ground. What happened to Akinosuke was more like a gradual homecoming, more like the way water, given enough time and a gentle enough slope, finds its way back to the sea. There was no dramatic moment of crossing, no clear border between waking and sleeping. There was simply the rain, and the tree, and the fragrance, and the sound, and Akinosuke. And then, very softly, very slowly, there was something else. Or rather, there was everything else. His eyes, which were already closed, which had been closed now for a long and unregistered time, seemed somehow to see nonetheless. Not with the effortful, constructed seeing of imagination, in which a person conjures images through will and memory, and the mechanics of the thinking mind. This was different. This was more like the seeing that happens on the surface of still water, images forming, not because anyone is trying to form them, but simply because the conditions for forming are perfect, because the surface is perfectly still, because the light is falling just so. The garden was still there. That was the first thing, the surprising thing. He had not gone somewhere else. The garden was still there, the stone path, the moss, the small, bright things his careful neglect had allowed to grow between the paving stones over the years. The dark, wet bark of the camphor tree, roots near where he sat. All of it was still there, and yet the light had changed. Something in the quality of the air had changed. There was a warmth now that had not been in the rain's coolness, a warmth that seemed to come not from above, not from any sun, but from the earth itself, from the garden itself, from the very roots of the camphor tree against whose trunk he rested. It was the warmth of something that has been alive for a very long time. The warmth of deep, patient, accumulated presence. And the rain was still falling. He could still hear it, but it was falling differently now, or he was hearing it differently, which in the end may be the same thing. Each drop seemed to take longer to arrive at wherever it was going. Each drop seemed to carry more of itself, more of its own particular story, as though rain, which is always, in the waking world, a collective and anonymous thing, a weather, a condition, had here become something more individual, each drop its own small and particular falling. He breathed, the camphor tree breathed, the garden breathed, and the afternoon, which had been so still and so ordinary and so quietly beautiful just a few minutes ago, or a few hours ago, or a few years ago, or at some time that the word ago no longer quite applies to, continued to deepen around him, the way a color deepens when the light that falls on it changes, revealing dimensions and subtleties that were always there, but that the ordinary, rushing, task-bearing light of daytime never quite had the patience to illuminate. Akinosuke was no longer quite in the place he had been. He was not somewhere else. He was not gone. He was still himself, still breathing, still receiving the faint coolness of rain-washed air, still vaguely aware of the great tree trunk at his back, of the moss-covered roots near his feet, of the small and patient world that went about its business in the grass, and the soil, and the bark, and the leaves around him. But the ordinary world, the world of the hammer in the distance, the world of the neighbor's gate, the world of the lunch he had eaten, and the tasks he had thought briefly about before deciding not to think about them. That world had grown very quiet, very distant, very much like something seen from a great height or a great depth that remains visible but no longer presses. And into that quietness, into that particular rain-washed, camphor-scented, afternoon gold, summer-heavy, ancient tree-sheltered quietness, something was beginning to arrive, or perhaps something had always been arriving, and Akinosuke had only now become still enough to notice. The rain fell. The leaves accepted it. The roots drew it slowly down. The garden, which had always been both more and less than a garden, which had always been a kind of threshold, a kind of in-between place, tended by a man who was himself something of an in-between person. The garden held him with the same quiet faithfulness with which it held everything else. The rain, the moss, the beetles, the afternoon, The ancient tree, the long and unhurried summer. Akinosuke's breath slowed to the rhythm of rain. His hands lay open, and the afternoon continued to do what afternoons in the middle of summer, beneath old camphor trees, in gardens tended with loving inattention, on the edge of villages where the cedar forest presses close. What such afternoons have always done, and will always do, as long as there are gardens and trees and rain, and people patient enough to sit still within them. It deepened, and he went with it. This is where the dreaming begins. The messenger in yellow robes. There is a moment in the very deepest part of rest when the sleeping mind does something extraordinary. It stops constructing. For most of the night, for most of every sleep, the mind is busy. It is sorting the day's experiences, filing some away, discarding others, processing the small and large emotional residues of having been alive and conscious for another 16 or 17 hours. It is rehearsing, revising, replaying. It builds its dreams from the materials it has on hand. Faces remembered, places visited, fears half formed, and hopes half understood. All of it assembled into narratives that follow their own interior logic. Strange, and yet somehow always recognizable, always stamped with the particular signature of the self that dreamed them. But there is a moment, rare, and most people pass through it without knowing it. The way a person passes through a beautiful country while asleep in a moving train, when all of that construction ceases. When the mind, exhausted finally, even by its own dreaming, lets go of the machinery. When it stops building and simply opens, and in that opening, something else becomes possible, something that is not built, but received. Akinosuke had reached that place. He could not have said how long he had been beneath the camphor tree. Time, which in waking life moves in one direction at one speed with the reliable monotony of a clock, had here become something more like weather, present, felt, but not measurable, not linear, not something one could look at and say, yes, it has been this many minutes, this many hours. It was simply there, the way the rain was there, the way the warmth of the earth was there, surrounding him, moving through him, but not owned by him, and not requiring him to keep track of it. The garden was still around him. He was still, in some sense, aware of it, the great weight of the camphor tree at his back, the small sounds of water finding its way through the leaves, and the moss and the grooves of the roots. The rain had not stopped. If anything, it had settled into an even deeper rhythm, a more resolved and unhurried falling, as though it had moved past whatever initial urgency had caused it to begin, and had arrived at its truest nature, which was simply this: to fall, and to fall, and to fall, with the complete and inexhaustible patience of water that has all of time. But the garden, as he perceived it now, was different. He had noticed this earlier, or what felt like earlier, in that slippery, directionless sense of time that existed here, and it had not alarmed him. It had simply registered, the way a change in the quality of light registers when one walks from one room into another. Noticed, absorbed, accepted. The garden was still the garden. The stones were still the stones. The moss was still impossibly, darkly green. The camphor roots still arched from the earth in their ancient, geological curves. And yet, there was something in the light that was not the same. In the waking world, the afternoon had been heavy and diffuse, the gray pewter light of a summer rain, which flattens shadows and makes everything seem slightly two-dimensional, slightly like a painting of itself rather than itself. But now, the light had warmth in it that had not been there before. Not sunlight. There was no sun visible, no single source casting rays or making shadows. It was more as though the light came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The way light sometimes looks in very old paintings, where the painters did not bother with a specific light source, because the light they were trying to capture was not the light of any particular place or time of day, but the light of meaning, of significance, of this moment mattering. Everything in the garden was slightly luminous. The stones on the path, the water standing in the hollow of a root, the undersides of leaves, even the air itself seemed to hold a faint, sourceless radiance, not bright enough to be called glowing, but present enough to give everything it touched a quality of being seen, truly seen, in a way that ordinary light rarely manages. Akinosuke breathed all of this in. He was not afraid. This is worth saying, worth dwelling on for a moment, because a different kind of person, a person who moved faster through the world, who kept a tighter grip on the ordinary, who needed at all times to know precisely where the borders were between what was real and what was not, might have felt, at this point, the first stirrings of anxiety, might have felt the vertigo of a world becoming unfamiliar, might have tried to wake themselves, to snap back to the safe and knowable country of ordinary afternoon. But Akinosuke was not that kind of person. He was the kind of person who had sat beneath a tree in the rain and simply breathed. He was the kind of person who had learned, over the long and patient years of his life, that the most interesting things, the things that carried the most meaning, the most beauty, the most of whatever it is that makes a life feel as though it has been worth the living, tended to arrive not when one was rushing toward them, but when one had stopped rushing altogether, when one had become still enough that the world could approach without being frightened off by the noise of a person trying too hard. So he was not afraid. He was attentive. There is a difference, and it is the difference between closing and opening. And it was in this state, this open, rain-washed, tree-sheltered, luminous-aired attentiveness that he first became aware of the figure on the path. He did not arrive with drama. There was no sudden appearance, no flash or sound, or any of the theatrical entrances that dreams sometimes manufacture when they wish to announce something important. He was simply there, the way a thought is sometimes simply there when one becomes aware of it, present for some time before the consciousness catches up and says, "Oh, I see. I have been thinking this. This has been with me." The man stood on the stone path, approximately 10 paces from where Akinosuke sat. He was small, not in the way of a child, which is a smallness of incompletion, but in the way of something perfectly achieved at a modest scale, the way a fine piece of lacquerwork is small, or a very good poem. He stood with complete composure, without the slight, unconscious fidgeting, the weight shifting, the hands adjusting, the small, unnecessary movements that most people deploy simply to prove to themselves and others that they are alive and present. He was still in the way that only very old things or very certain things are still, without effort, without the shadow of any alternative. His robes. Akinosuke noticed the robes before he noticed the face. This was perhaps because the robes were the most immediately extraordinary thing about the figure, or perhaps because the face, when he eventually looked at it, turned out to be less definable than the robes. The face had the quality of something seen in peripheral vision, clear when not looked at directly, but softening, becoming less specific when the attention turned toward it fully. But the robes were unmistakable. They were the color of amber, of deep golden yellow, of the particular shade one finds in a flame at its most settled and steady, not at its edges where it goes orange and blue, but at its heart where the color is most itself, the fabric, whatever it was. And it did not look like any fabric Akinosuke could name from his waking experience. Moved with an extraordinary quality of weight and flow, as though it were heavier than it looked and lighter than it seemed simultaneously, as though it were fabric the way deep water is water, familiar in category, profound in substance. The sleeves were long. The collar was high. There were details at the hem and cuffs, embroidered, perhaps, or perhaps simply the effect of the strange light catching on the texture of the cloth that suggested patterns, though the patterns were too intricate to read at a distance, more felt than seen. The way one feels the presence of meaning in a piece of music one is hearing for the first time. The man's hands were folded before him, invisible in the sleeves. He was looking at Akinosuke, not with urgency, not with the forward, pressing quality of a look that wants something, that is already anticipating the answer, already halfway to the next moment. He was looking with the quality of someone who has arrived somewhere and is simply acknowledging that he has arrived and that the person he has come to see is there to be seen, this is sufficient. For now, for this moment, there is no hurry. And then he bowed. It was a deep bow, a bow of genuine and considered respect, not the perfunctory, habitual bow of social obligation, not the slight nod that passes for deference in casual encounters, but a full, slow, deliberate bow that spoke of practice, of meaning, of an understanding that the act of bowing is not merely a physical courtesy, but a philosophical statement. I see you. You matter. I am smaller in this moment than my recognition of you. He held the bow for what felt like a long time, long enough for Akinosuke to feel it, long enough for it to register, not just as gesture, but as communication. Then he straightened, and when he spoke, his voice was exactly what the rest of him had promised. It was not loud. It was not trying to carry or to impress. It had the quality of a sound that knows it will be heard because it is being listened for the way rain. In that first quiet moment after you become aware of it, seems to grow louder, not because it is raining harder, but because you are now attending to it, because you have opened yourself to it. The voice had that quality. It arrived not because it was projecting itself at him, but because he was receiving it, because the space between them had become the right kind of space, a listening space. Honored guest, the small man said. 2 words. But in those 2 words, in the particular, unhurried, perfectly weighted delivery of those 2 words, there was a whole architecture of meaning. There was respect, genuine and unperformative. There was recognition, the particular warmth of being seen by someone who has looked carefully and truly, not just glanced. There was patience. There was the implication, not stated, not even quite implied, but somehow present in the air around the words, the way fragrance is present in the air around a flower, that this meeting had been anticipated, that it was not accidental, that there was, in some sense that did not require explanation or justification, a rightness to this moment, to this garden, to this particular man, sitting under this particular tree, on this particular rain-soft afternoon. Akinosuke did not speak. Not yet. He waited in the way that one waits when one understands instinctively that what is coming has not finished arriving. The small man's posture was unchanged. His hands were still folded in his sleeves. The amber robes moved very slightly in an air current that Akinosuke could not feel on his own skin, as though the robes existed in a slightly different layer of the world than he did, subject to different, gentler conditions. The king of Tokoyo, the small man continued, with a careful and beautiful deliberateness, sends his warmest and most sincere greetings. A pause, not the pause of someone searching for words, but the pause of someone who understands that words need room around them to be properly heard. And he humbly invites you to his palace. The word humbly landed with particular care. It was said as though it mattered that it be the right word, as though many words had been considered, and this one chosen not for its convenience, but for its accuracy. A king who humbly invites, not commands, not summons, not requests with the weight of authority behind the request, humbly invites, as one person might invite another to share something good, as a host might invite a guest they genuinely wish to welcome, holding nothing over the invitation, attaching no obligation to the coming, leaving the door open and the lantern lit, and the decision entirely, freely, with full grace, in the hands of the one invited. Akinosuke looked at the small man in his amber robes, standing on the stone path in the luminous rain light of this garden that was and was not his garden. He thought, or the thing that was standing in for thought in this deep, unhurried country of his rest, about asking questions. He was aware, dimly, of the existence of questions. The kind of questions that the ordinary waking mind would manufacture with great speed and anxiety. Who are you? What king? What palace? Where? How did you come here? What does this mean? What am I supposed to do? Is this safe? Is this real? But the questions did not form, or they formed barely at the very edges of awareness, and then dissolved, not suppressed, not refused, but simply unnecessary, the way an umbrella is simply unnecessary on a clear day, not because the situation had answered them, but because the situation was of a kind where they did not apply, where the usual framework of verification and caution and rational accounting, however useful in other contexts, was simply not the instrument needed here. This was not that kind of moment. He understood this the way one understands things in the deepest rest, not by reasoning toward the understanding, but by finding it already there, already present, like a stone that has been on the path all along and is only now noticed. This was a moment that asked for something simpler than questions. It asked for the willingness to take the next step. Not a large willingness, not the heroic, muscular willingness of someone deciding to do something difficult and brave. A quiet willingness, the willingness of water finding its level, the willingness of a leaf letting go when autumn comes, not dramatic, not reluctant, simply ready. Akinosuke was ready. He was aware as he began to move, as his hands pressed lightly against the moss-covered root, and his body unfolded from its long rest against the trunk, with a slowness that matched the slowness of everything else in this place, of the camphor tree behind him. He was aware of it, the way one is aware of something very large and very old and very good that one is in the presence of, not turning to look at it, not needing to, simply knowing it was there, simply feeling in the slight warmth at his back as he moved away from it, a quality of leave-taking that was not sorrowful but was tender, the way leaving any good place is tender, even when one knows or senses or trusts that the leaving is right. His feet found the stone path. The stones were solid beneath him, real in every sense that mattered. He could feel their surface through the thin soles of his shoes, the slight unevenness of hand-laid stone, each one a slightly different height and texture, the result of years of weather and the slow, patient work of moss and lichen at the edges. He had walked this path 10,000 times and knew it the way one knows a piece of music one has played, until the fingers know it independently of the mind. And yet, walking it now in this light, toward this small figure who had bowed so fully and waited so patiently, it felt new. It felt like the first time, not in the disorienting way that nothing being recognizable is the first time, but in the deeper, better sense, the sense that something familiar, properly attended to, can always yield its newness, can always reveal that it was never merely familiar, that it always contained more than the habituated eye could see. The small man had turned without haste and was now walking ahead of him on the path. His steps were unhurried. They had a quality of precision about them, not the precision of someone trying to step correctly, but the precision of someone whose relationship with the ground beneath them is so long established and easy that each step is simply right, the way a word spoken by someone who truly knows it is simply right, landing with an inevitability that makes it feel as though no other word could have existed. Akinosuke followed. This is perhaps the simplest thing that can be said, and yet it carries everything. He followed, not because he had been commanded, not because he had been persuaded, not because he had weighed the options and found this one preferable. He followed because in this moment, in this garden, in this rain, following felt like the most natural thing in the world. Felt, in fact, like the thing he had been sitting still long enough to be ready for, the thing that all the sitting, all the breathing, all the patient, unhurried presence beneath the camphor tree had been, in some unplanned and unplanning way, preparing him for, not a destination, not an answer, simply the next step, the gate of his garden, which in ordinary circumstances required the lifting of a latch, a small iron latch that had grown slightly stiff with rust, and that he kept meaning to oil and never did stood open. He did not remember it being open. He could not have said whether the small man had opened it or whether it had simply been open, whether the garden had understood what was needed and arranged itself accordingly. Such questions, again, did not press. The gate was open. The path continued beyond it, and the path was different from the road he knew. Not his road, not the dirt track that led along the edge of the cedar forest to the village, but something new, something that began exactly where his path ended, and yet went somewhere his path had never gone. He stepped through the gate. The rain continued to fall. It fell on his face and on his hands and on the amber robes of the small man walking ahead of him, and it fell on the new road and on the grass beside it, and on whatever lay ahead, beyond the first soft curve where the path turned, and what was there could not yet be seen. It fell with complete impartiality and complete abundance, the way only rain falls, making no distinctions, honoring everything it touches, asking nothing in return. Akinosuke walked into it, and the garden, his garden, the camphor tree, the stone path he had walked 10,000 times, the gate with the stiff iron latch, grew smaller behind him, and then smaller still, and then disappeared around the curve of the road as he followed the small man in his amber robes toward whatever the king of Tokoyo's humble invitation had been extending toward all along. He did not look back, not from indifference, and not from the nervous forward-facing of someone afraid of what looking back might cost them. He did not look back simply because he was not a man who needed to look back. He had sat long enough and breathed deeply enough and been still enough that he carried the garden with him. He carried the tree. He carried the sound of rain on leaves, which was already indistinguishable from the sound of rain on the road ahead. The same rain, the same sound, the same gentle, unhurried, inexhaustible falling. He carried all of it forward, and the afternoon, that same extraordinary, pewter-lit, camphor-scented, rain-graced, boundary-dissolving summer afternoon, went with him, and so the road began. And the road, as all good roads do, knew exactly where it was going. The kingdom beneath the camphor tree. There is something that happens to a person when they walk a road they have never walked before. Not the anxious something, not the watchful, calculating alertness of someone in unfamiliar territory who is mapping exits and measuring distances and keeping one hand metaphorically on the door. That is a different thing entirely, and it belongs to a different kind of road, a different kind of walking. No, the something that happened to Akinosuke as he followed the small man in amber robes along the new road was quieter than that, and older, and in many ways more profound. It was wonder, not the loud, exclamatory wonder of someone encountering something spectacular, not the wonder that opens the mouth and widens the eyes and reaches for words, always inadequate, always slightly behind the experience they are trying to describe. It was the softer wonder, the wonder that closes the mouth and opens something deeper, the wonder that does not reach for anything because it understands, instinctively, that reaching would interrupt, that the only appropriate response to certain kinds of beauty is to become very still inside and let it pass through you. The way the most beautiful music is not the music you analyze or admire from a distance, but the music that enters you without asking permission and rearranges something small and essential in the interior of your chest, and leaves you, when it ends, slightly different from what you were. That was the kind of wonder Akinosuke walked in. The road itself was unlike any road he had known in his waking life. And yet, and this was the particular quality of everything in this place, it was not strange in a way that disturbed. It was strange in the way that very beautiful things are sometimes strange, in the way that makes you realize the ordinary world has been holding out on you, has been showing you a version of itself that is real but incomplete, and that here, in this other light, in this rain-washed, luminous country, the fuller version is simply present, simply available, simply waiting for someone patient enough to arrive. The path beneath his feet was stone, a pale, warm stone, the color of old ivory or of winter sunlight, laid with a care so long past that the individual stones had grown into each other at their edges, softened by time, and weathered into something that no longer looked constructed but grown, as though the road had always been there, and the earth had simply, over centuries, revealed it. Between the stones, in every joint and crack, grew things, small, precise, various, moss in 7 shades of green that he could not have named, but could feel the difference between. Miniature ferns no bigger than his thumbnail. Tiny flowering things in colors so specific and so quietly extraordinary that they seemed less like wildflowers and more like punctuation. Small, perfect emphases in a sentence the road was writing as it went. He walked carefully at first, out of instinct, out of the old habit of watching where one steps. Then he realized, and the realization came as a small, sweet relief, that there was nothing to watch for. The road was entirely, peacefully benign. It asked nothing of his feet except that he place them, one after the other, and continue. So he continued. The small man walked ahead of him at a distance of perhaps 5 or 6 paces, close enough to follow without effort, far enough to allow silence between them without the silence becoming awkward. He did not speak. He did not look back. He walked with the same quality of precision and ease that Akinosuke had noticed in the garden, each step placed with the unhurried certainty of someone who has walked this road many times and finds in the familiarity not boredom, but a kind of deepening affection. The way one can read a beloved book many times and find it not diminished, but enriched by each reading, each familiarity revealing a nuance that previous readings had prepared one to notice. The amber of his robes moved. It caught or created. It was difficult to say which, a quality of warmth in the air around him, a slight aureate shimmer, as though the color itself were generating a gentle light. In the gray soft rain, this warmth was extraordinary. It was like following a small, walking flame, like following the last warmth of an autumn afternoon through the first blue of evening, comforting in a way that could not be explained by anything other than itself. On either side of the road, the world opened. On the left, A meadow stretched away into a soft, rain-blurred distance. The grass there was a color that Akinosuke could not name with any word he owned. Not green exactly, or not only green. There was blue in it, and silver, and something else. Something that might have been a color he simply had never encountered before, and therefore had no word for. The way there are emotions that exist before the language for them exists, felt fully but unnamed, waiting for someone to invent the word that fits them. The grass moved in a wind he could not feel. Or perhaps it moved for reasons of its own, following an interior current, a private weather. It moved in long, slow waves, like the surface of deep water, like breathing. Wildflowers grew in the meadow. Thousands of them, in no pattern, in every color, distributed with the gorgeous indifference of nature, which does not compose so much as simply allow. They were luminous, every one of them, catching and returning the diffuse rain light with an intensity that seemed disproportionate, as though each small flower were lit from within by something that had been there since before it bloomed, and would remain after it was gone. On the right, the meadow was different, lower, softer, moving toward a lake that appeared between trees at irregular intervals as the road curved. The lake, when he could see it, was extraordinary in its stillness. In the waking world, rain on water makes noise and movement, disturbs the surface, turns it into a constantly shifting, pockmarked gray. But here, the rain fell on the lake, and the lake received it without visible disturbance, as though the surface were not water at all, but some other substance. Some substance that could be touched without being changed, that had achieved a stillness so fundamental that even rain could not alter it, could only add to it. The way silence is not diminished by the sound of distant, soft things, but deepened by them. The surface of the lake was the color of the sky it reflected, and the sky it reflected was the sky above it, pale, luminous, perfectly even, but the reflection was more purely itself than the sky above. The way reflections sometimes are, more concentrated, more essential, as though the water had taken the sky and distilled it, kept only what was most true about it, and let the rest go. He looked at it until the road curved, and the trees closed, and the lake was gone. Then there were the trees. He had entered gradually, and without announcement. A woodland, not the cedar forest he knew from the edge of his village, with its tall, straight, serious trunks pressing close, and its floor deep in fallen needles and shadow, but something different. These were older trees, he sensed, though they did not look old in the way that ancient trees in his world looked old, gnarled and scarred, and magnificent in their damage. These trees looked old the way very wise people sometimes look old, not diminished, but refined, every unnecessary thing shed, only the essential remaining, and the essential luminous. Their bark was silver gray, deeply textured, with the kind of surface that rewards close looking. That gives more the longer the eye stays with it. Their canopies were wide and interlocking, creating above the road a long, vaulted corridor of branch and leaf, through which the rain fell in strings of silver light, each drop catching the diffuse luminescence of the air and becoming, for its brief falling life, a small and perfect lamp. The sound in this corridor was extraordinary. Rain through a canopy of leaves is always beautiful, but here it was something beyond beautiful, something for which beautiful is a necessary but insufficient word. The leaves above him were of different sizes and shapes and thicknesses, and so each caught the rain differently and spoke differently. Some with a high, bright tap, some with a deeper, rounder tone, some with a long, sustained sound like a brushed cymbal, some with the quick, precise percussion of a single drop on a taut surface. All of these sounds together created something that was simultaneously music and not music, simultaneously random and composed, the way the most extraordinary natural acoustics always are. As though the world, given the right conditions, is always composing something, and we simply rarely find ourselves in the right conditions to hear it. Akinosuke walked through the sound as much as through the space. He walked inside it. It surrounded him, entered him, moved through him the way music moves through a body when the body is fully open to it, not just heard with the ears, but felt in the chest, in the throat, in the soles of the feet, on the pale, old stones. He did not try to remember it. He understood, in that deep and wordless way of this place, that trying to remember something like this would be like trying to hold rain in open hands. Not impossible exactly, but not the point. The point was not to capture it. The point was to be in it, fully, now, without the slight withdrawal that the act of memorizing requires. To be here entirely, and let it be entirely here, and trust that whatever of it needed to remain would remain, in whatever form things that matter always remain, not as memory exactly, but as something deeper than memory, something that becomes part of the body's own knowing, part of the way the breath moves, part of whatever it is that makes a person, after an encounter with something true and beautiful, permanently and irreversibly slightly larger than they were before. The corridor of trees opened, and there, across a final stretch of road that descended gently through a garden of unutterable, rain-softened beauty, through arrangements of stone and water and flowering things that seemed simultaneously carefully designed and entirely natural, as only the very greatest gardens ever managed to seem. There was the palace. Akinosuke stopped walking, not from hesitation, not from fear. He stopped the way one sometimes stops in the middle of a piece of music that one loves, not to end it, not to interrupt it, but simply because the moment is so full that the body needs a breath, needs a pause, needs a single still point from which to take in what is there before moving into it. The palace was not what the word palace, in his waking experience, might have suggested. He had seen in his life, in his travels, in the images of things he had read about, and imagined the kind of palaces that announce themselves. The kind that are built to overwhelm, to subordinate, to make the approaching person feel small by design, by the deliberate deployment of scale and grandeur, and the architectural grammar of power. Towers, battlements, gates that are less entrances than statements, stone cut to say, here is strength, here is permanence, here is something that will outlast everything including you, and knows it. This was nothing like that. This palace was low and wide, spreading across the landscape, not with the verticality of assertion, but with the horizontality of welcome. Its roof lines curved upward at the edges in long, gentle arcs, not dramatically, not in the exaggerated flourish of a building trying to be beautiful, but with the subtle, natural curve of something that has been shaped by the same forces that shape water and wings and the long lines of distant hills. The roofs were covered in something that was the color of deep moss, and in the rain, this color was extraordinary. So saturated, so alive, so specifically and perfectly that one green among all possible greens, that it looked less like a surface covering, and more like the palace was growing, slowly, upward from the earth, the way living things grow, from the ground toward the light, with patience and without strain. The walls were a warm, pale stone, the same stone as the road, he thought, or a stone in the same family, speaking the same quiet language. The stone had weathered to a surface that was not perfectly smooth and not rough, but somewhere between, a surface with depth and variation that the rain darkened in some places and left pale in others, creating a constantly shifting, water-painted pattern of light and shadow that made the walls seem to breathe. And the windows, they were many and various in size, and placed without the rigid symmetry of a building that values order over life. Placed, rather, as one places things in a room that one actually lives in, where the arrangement follows the needs of the living rather than the demands of the plan. Each window was lit from within, not brightly, not with the aggressive declaration of illumination as power, but softly, warmly, with the amber glow of lanterns, of fireside light, of the particular light that exists in rooms where people are present, and the presence is good, where something is being cooked, where something is being said that is worth saying, where the evening has come in from the cold, and the inside has made itself worthy of the coming in. From where he stood, Akinosuke could not see the people inside, but he could feel the warmth of them. He could feel the palace's inhabited quality, its fullness, its life, the way one can sometimes feel passing a lit window on a cold night, the warmth of the room within, the presence of people doing ordinary, essential things, and feel in that perception a complex emotion that is part longing and part recognition, and part something that does not have a name, but that means, approximately, this is what it is. This is the thing, this warmth and this light, and this being together in the evening. This is the thing that matters. The garden before the palace was extraordinary. He descended into it slowly, the road becoming a path, becoming a sequence of stepping stones across a shallow stream that ran with the most perfectly clear, perfectly cold water he had ever seen water, in which every pebble of the streambed was visible with the hyperreal clarity of things seen in this world. Each stone distinct, each one itself, each one precisely and beautifully what it was. He stepped across the stones carefully, not because he was unsteady, but because each stone deserved the weight of a careful step, deserved to be chosen deliberately rather than rushed across. On the other side of the stream, the path wound between arrangements of stone and planting that had the quality of the best gardens everywhere, the quality of inevitability, as though each stone had been placed in the only possible position it could occupy, and the plants growing beside it had always been growing there, and the small, curved bridge over the second, narrower stream had always crossed it at exactly that angle, and the lantern lit amber. A small, warm star hung at the height of a tall man's shoulder on a simple wooden post, had always stood at exactly that curve in the path, casting its light at exactly that angle onto the wet stones and the rain-dark moss, and the absolutely still surface of the small pond it faced, a pond in which Akinosuke noticed as he passed it the lit windows of the palace were perfectly reflected. 2 palaces then, one rising from the earth in stone and moss and warm windowlight, one hanging, inverted, in the stillness of dark water. Both real, both present, both equally themselves. He stopped for a moment and looked between them up, then down, then up again, and felt something loosen very gently in his chest, some last small holding that he had not known was held. The small man in amber robes had reached the entrance to the palace and was waiting. He stood at the threshold with the same quality of patient, unhurried presence that had characterized him since the garden, since the stone path, since the deep bow, since the voice like rain on a wooden roof. He was waiting not with the slight tension of someone who wishes you would hurry, not with the performance of patience that is secretly impatience wearing a polite face. He was waiting the way the palace seemed to wait, the way the garden seemed to wait, the way everything in this place seemed to wait, with an absolute ease, an absolute sufficiency in the present moment. an absolute absence of any need for anything to be other than exactly as it was. Akinosuke came to the threshold. The entrance was framed in dark, beautifully grained old wood that had been old for a long time, and had arrived, through its long aging, at a density and richness of color and surface that new wood does not possess and cannot be given. It was wood that had been touched many times, that bore in its surface the faint, invisible record of every hand that had passed across it, every shoulder that had brushed it entering or leaving, every season that had breathed on it and been breathed in return. He reached out, without quite knowing he was going to, and placed his hand flat against the wood of the doorframe. It was warm, not the warmth of a surface heated by sun or fire, but the deeper warmth of something living, or something that had been so long in the presence of the living that it had absorbed warmth as permanently as it had absorbed color, as permanently as it had absorbed the slow, layered record of every moment that had occurred near it. The warmth of witness, the warmth of a thing that has stood at the threshold of many arrivals and many departures, and has held them all quietly, without judgment, without preference, simply present for each one. Akinosuke felt, with his hand on that wood, that he was arriving somewhere he had not known he was going. Not in the disorienting sense, not with the vertigo of a wrong turn. In the opposite sense, in the sense of arriving somewhere so right that the rightness of it has a quality of recognition, as though some part of him had known this place before the rest of him had ever set out to find it. He stepped inside. The entrance hall was high-ceilinged and warm, lit by lanterns hung at intervals that created pools of amber light with soft, breathing shadows between them. The floor was stone, covered in places with woven mats of a pale, fine grass that absorbed sound and softened the foot. The air smelled of cedar and something sweet, sandalwood perhaps, or something like it, or something entirely of this place that only resembled sandalwood the way a translation resembles its original, recognizably related, essentially itself, from somewhere deeper in the palace, from behind a screen, from around a corner, from wherever the warmth and light were most concentrated, came the faint sound of voices, not distinguishable, not yet, simply present, simply human, the sound of people in a room together, speaking at the pace of people who are not in a hurry, who have time, who are enjoying the conversation for its own sake, rather than for wherever it might arrive. The sound was one of the most comforting things Akinosuke had ever heard. The small man bowed once more, that same full, deliberate, meaning-filled bow, and gestured with a single, unhurried movement of his amber-sleeved arm toward the interior. Then he stepped back and was still, and waited with the complete and patient grace that was his nature. As Akinosuke moved forward into the warmth and the lantern light, and the cedar-scented, voice-murmuring, window-glowing interior of the palace of the King of Tokoyo, the rain continued outside as it had throughout, as it always had, as it always would, falling on the moss roof and the pale stone walls and the still pond and the garden and the pale old road and the woodland and the meadows and the lake that reflected the sky more truly than the sky reflected itself, falling soft and patient and inexhaustible on everything, on the camphor tree far behind him now, still standing in its garden at the edge of a village, where a man sat with his back against its trunk, his hands open, his breath slow, his eyes closed, falling on all of it at once, as rain does, making no distinctions, honoring everything it touched. And the king was waiting, and the lanterns were lit, and the evening in this place had only just begun. A life lived in the folds of sleep. There are certain moments in a life that do not announce themselves as the moments they are. They do not arrive with ceremony or forewarning. They do not send ahead the feeling of significance, that particular interior weight that tells a person, pay attention. Something is happening here that you will want to remember. They come quietly, ordinarily, wearing the plain clothes of just another moment, just another room entered, just another threshold crossed. And it is only later, much later, sometimes only in the very last reckoning of a very long life, that a person looks back and sees, there, that was it. That was the place where everything turned. That was the hinge on which the whole story swung open into something new. For Akinosuke, that moment was the one in which he stepped fully into the warmth of the palace and heard, for the first time, the voice of the King of Tokoyo. He had been led through the entrance hall, past the breathing lanterns, across the pale woven mats, through a corridor where the cedar and sandalwood air grew warmer, and the sound of voices grew gradually more present, more specific, more particular by the small man in amber robes, who moved ahead of him with that same precise, unhurried grace, each step deliberate, each movement exactly sufficient, and no more. The corridor turned once, then again, and then opened, not dramatically, not with the architectural announcement of a grand doorway, but simply and gently, the way a path opens when it arrives at a clearing into a room. It was a large room, but not in the way that makes a person feel small. It was large in the way that good rooms are sometimes large, generously, warmly, with a scale that seems calibrated not to the building's ambitions, but to the needs of the people who will inhabit it. The ceiling was high enough that the lanterns hung at different levels created a kind of interior sky, an amber sky, warm and various, flickering very slightly, breathing with its own slow life. The The walls were paneled in the same beautiful, aged dark wood as the doorframe he had touched on entering, and they held that same quality of accumulated warmth, of long-absorbed presence. Screens divided parts of the room from other parts, creating within the largeness a series of smaller intimacies, a sense that the room was not one space, but a collection of spaces nested within each other, each with its own quality of light and air, each suited to a different kind of being in. Near one screen, a low table held a tea arrangement of considerable beauty and simplicity. Near another, cushions were arranged in the unhurried, slightly asymmetrical way of furnishings that are used regularly by people who care about comfort, but not about appearance. Flowers, simple ones, single stems, placed in vessels of plain ceramic, stood here and there with the particular poise of flowers that have been chosen and placed by someone who understands that one flower in the right vessel in the right place says everything that 100 flowers in the wrong vessel say nothing. And at the far end of the room, seated on a low dais that raised him not above others in the manner of a throne, but simply gave him a position from which he could see and be seen without effort, seated with the quality of stillness that is the exclusive property of those who have long since made their peace with sitting still, was the king. Akinosuke's first impression was of age, not the diminished age of someone who has lived long and been reduced by it, ground down by the friction of years into something smaller and paler than they were. This was the other age, the age that accumulates rather than diminishes, that adds rather than takes away, that arrives at the end of a long life, not with emptiness, but with a density so profound it has become its own kind of lightness, the way a very dense and very old piece of wood becomes, past a certain point, almost weightless in the hand. The king's face was lined deeply, beautifully, with the specific lines that come from a specific life, from having looked into the distance a great many times, from having listened carefully to a great many people, from having made decisions that mattered and lived with their consequences, from having loved and grieved and continued, from having found, over many years and through many seasons, the slow and unspectacular and absolutely essential practice of being at peace with what is. His eyes were the most remarkable thing. They were dark and very clear, and they held in them that quality that is the rarest of all qualities in a human face, the quality of genuine, unconditional attention. He was looking at Akinosuke with the full weight of his presence, not assessing, not evaluating, not composing his response to what he was seeing, simply looking, simply receiving, as though Akinosuke were the most interesting thing in the world, not because Akinosuke had done anything to make himself interesting, but because the king was the kind of person for whom every person who entered his presence was, by virtue of existing, by virtue of carrying within them the full and extraordinary complexity of a human life, genuinely, bottomlessly interesting. He rose slowly, with the careful dignity of age, but without any of the apology that age sometimes makes for itself, without any of the performance of managing the difficulty of rising, and he bowed. Not the deep, floor-directed bow of the messenger, but a bow of a different kind, the bow of an equal to an equal, or of a host to a guest whom he is genuinely glad to receive. A bow that said, "You are welcome here," not as a courtesy, as a fact. Akinosuke, he said, simply the name. But the way he said it, with a weight and a warmth that suggested the name, was not merely a label, but a recognition. Not merely how he was called, but who he was. Made the simple syllables feel like the opening of something, the first note of something that would take time to fully unfold. "I am very glad," the king continued, settling back onto his cushion with the ease of someone returning to a familiar and beloved place, "that you have come." There was tea. There was the particular ceremony of tea in this place, which was not the formal, codified ceremony of the waking world, not the performance of precision, but something older and less structured and more genuinely ceremonial in the truest sense. A ritual of attention, of care, of the shared acknowledgement that this moment, this warmth, this cup held in both hands, this steam rising in the lantern light, that these things matter, that they are worth slowing down for, that the whole of human civilization, in its best and truest form, is nothing more and nothing less than the accumulated practice of recognizing what is worth slowing down for. They spoke, or the king spoke, and Akinosuke listened, and then Akinosuke spoke, and the king listened, and the exchange between them had the quality of a conversation between people who are not trying to win anything, not trying to prove anything, not conducting the usual commerce of human talk in which words are currency and attention is strategic. They were simply speaking and listening, and the speaking and listening were the same act. The king spoke of the seasons, of the particular beauty of each one, not the general beauty that everyone acknowledges, the postcard beauty of cherry blossoms and autumn leaves, but the specific, private beauty that requires patience and attention to see, the beauty of the first day of spring that does not look like spring yet, that looks like the last day of winter, but in which something, some quality of light, some temperature of the air, some barely perceptible loosening in the earth announces, to those listening carefully enough, that the long holding is almost over, the beauty of midsummer at its most oppressive, when the heat is almost unbearable and the air is thick, and every living thing has slowed to a near stillness. And in that near stillness, if one is patient, one can hear something, some deep, accumulated, sun-saturated aliveness in the world that the more comfortable seasons drown out. He spoke of rain. Of course he spoke of rain. He spoke of it with the affection of someone who has understood, over a very long life, that rain is not an interruption of the world's beauty, but one of its most faithful expressions. That the world in rain is more itself than the world in any other weather, more honest, more revealed. The surfaces stripped of the slight distance that dry air creates between a thing and its appearance. Everything in rain pressing closer to its own truth. And then, after a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was itself a kind of communication, after a silence that said, "What I am about to say is different from what I have been saying, and deserves its own space, its own arrival." The king set down his teacup with the deliberateness of someone making a decision, and looked at Akinosuke with those dark, clear, fully attentive eyes. "I have a daughter," he said. He said it simply, without preamble, without the rhetorical architecture that important propositions sometimes construct around themselves to seem more reasonable, more inevitable, more foregone. He said it the way one states something that is simply true, and that being true requires no decoration. "She is," he continued, and then paused, not searching for the word, but honoring it, making space for it to arrive with its full weight. Remarkable. Another pause. The lanterns breathed. "I would like, if it is your wish, entirely your wish, with no obligation of any kind attached to the asking, to offer you her hand, and a place here in this kingdom, for as long as you choose to remain, which may be all your life, or which may be less. The choice is yours entirely, and I will think no less of you for whatever you decide." Akinosuke sat with this. In the waking world, such a proposal from a king in a palace, delivered with this gravity, would have generated in him a cascade of thoughts, practical and emotional and social, a rushing calculation of what it meant, and what it required, and what it would cost, and whether he was adequate to it. But here, in this amber-lit, cedar-scented room, with the rain still falling outside, and the king looking at him with complete, patient, unjudging steadiness, there was no cascade. There was simply the proposal, sitting in the air between them, and Akinosuke sitting with the proposal, and the question settling into him the way rain settles into dry earth, not violently, not forcefully, but with a gentle, inevitable permeation that reaches, in time, every part. He thought of the garden. He thought of the camphor tree. He thought of his life at the edge of the cedar forest, which had been good, genuinely, quietly good, and which he did not regret and did not wish to undo. He thought of the long, patient years of living simply and attending carefully and finding in small things the sufficiency that others sought in large ones. And he thought, yes, not with drama, not with the breathless, vertigo-tinged yes of someone leaping from a height, with the quiet, grounded yes of someone who has been asked a question that they have, without knowing it, been holding the answer to for a long time. The yes of recognition rather than decision. "Yes," he said. The king smiled. And the smile was the final thing that needed to happen in that room. The closing of a circle. The resolution of something that had been moving toward resolution since the moment the small man in amber robes had appeared on the stone path in the rain. The princess came to him at the evening meal. Her name, he would learn it slowly over the days that followed, the name arriving to him in increments the way understanding of a person always arrives in increments, the name becoming more itself the more he knew what it belonged to, was of this place, of this palace, of this kingdom. It had in it the quality of water and of light and of something older than both. She was not what the word princess might construct in the imagination. She was not regal in the performed sense, not formal, not at a distance. She was present in the way that very few people manage to be present. Not the anxious, gripping presence of someone working hard at being here. Not the absent while appearing present quality of someone who is in the room, but somewhere else inside themselves. But the genuine, restful presence of someone who has arrived fully in wherever they are and has no part of themselves somewhere else. She was luminous. This is the word that came to him, sitting across from her at the low table with the rain outside and the lanterns inside and her father nearby, and the soft sound of the palace's inhabited life around them, luminous. Not in the sense of physical brightness, though there was that too, a clarity and warmth to her face and her eyes, and the way she held herself that the lantern light seemed to find and return. Luminous in the deeper sense, the sense of someone whose interior life is so genuine, so unperformative, so fully their own, that it shows in their presence the way a light shows through paper. Not blinding, not demanding, simply there, warm and steady, the kind of light that makes the space around it more itself. She listened to him. This was the first thing he noticed. Not her appearance, not the sound of her voice, not the grace of her movement, though all of these were extraordinary in their own quiet ways. The first thing was how she listened, with the full, unhurried, unjudging attention that her father had, but younger, warmer, less historical. The listening of someone who has learned to listen, not from long experience of being listened to and understanding its value, but from a genuine, innate interest in the other person, in what they carry, in what their eyes have seen that hers have not. She asked him about his garden, of all the things she might have asked, of all the diplomatic or conventional or getting to know you questions that a first conversation might have deployed. She asked about his garden. And in the asking was a knowledge of him that he could not account for by any ordinary means. A knowledge that the garden was not incidental to who he was, but essential. Not where he lived, but how he lived. Not background, but foreground. told her about it, all of it. The camphor tree and its roots, and the moss that grew in the hollows, and the way the light came through the leaves in the morning, and the way the rain sounded on its canopy in the afternoon. The vegetable garden to one side and the beautiful wilderness to the other. The stone path with its gentle curve. The gate with the stiff iron latch he had always meant to oil. He told her all of it, and she received all of it with the same quality of full, warm, unhurried attention. And when he had finished, she was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of having nothing to say, but the quiet of having been genuinely moved, and taking the time to let the being moved settle before speaking. "It sounds," she said, "like a place that knows how to hold a person." Yes, he thought. Yes, exactly that. The days began. This is perhaps the simplest and most extraordinary thing that can be said about what followed. The days simply began, one after another, with the uncomplicated succession of days in a place where nothing is fighting anything, where the rhythm of the hours and the seasons is not an obstacle to be managed, but a pleasure to be inhabited. They began the way days begin when a life has found its shape, not through crisis or decision, but through the gradual, organic settling of the right things into the right arrangement. The way water finds its level and stays there, not because it has been forced into position, but because position is simply what water does when the conditions allow. He learned the palace, its rooms and corridors and gardens, each with their own character, their own quality of light, their own particular way of receiving the different times of day and the different weathers. He learned the people of the household, the cooks who took their art with a seriousness that was also a joy, who spoke of ingredients with the affection of people describing beloved friends, who produced from simple things a sustenance so genuine that eating here was not a fueling, but a ceremony, a daily reiteration of the truth that to nourish a person is one of the most fundamental acts of love. He learned the gardeners, who worked with that same quality of loving inattention that he had practiced in his own garden, present, attentive, but never forcing, never imposing their own ideas on the living things in their care, simply providing the conditions and trusting the conditions. He learned the rain. The rain of this place was familiar, and yet more itself than the rain he had known, the same water, the same sound, the same fragrance of earth receiving what it needs, but here undiluted by anything else, here simply what it was, entirely and perfectly. It rained often. He was grateful every time, and he learned her, the princess, his wife, for they were married with a ceremony of such warmth and simplicity, and genuine, feeling that it remained with him afterward, not as an event to be remembered, but as a quality that suffused everything that followed, a warmth woven permanently into the texture of the days. His wife became, over time, the person he thought of when he thought of what it meant to know someone. Not the surface knowing, the knowing of facts and preferences and histories, though he had all of that too, the deeper knowing. The knowing that comes from sharing the ordinary, daily, unheroic intimacy of two lives, choosing to proceed alongside each other. The knowing that accumulates in small and unspectacular moments. In the particular way, she held her cup in both hands in the morning, in the sound of her voice carrying through the palace screens, in the way she looked at him, sometimes across a room, with an expression that contained, in its ordinary brevity, the entire sum of what was between them. They had children, 3 of them, each one a new kind of astonishment. The first came like spring comes, with a building anticipation, and then an arrival so complete, so totally itself, that all the anticipation seemed in retrospect to have been not preparation, but simply the long, necessary waiting that made the arrival what it was. A boy, small and determined and luminous, with the particular luminosity of new life, which is a luminosity different from all others. Not the refined luminosity of his mother, not the deep, accumulated luminosity of his grandfather, but the raw, unconditional luminosity of something that has just arrived from wherever lives come from, and has not yet learned to dim itself. The second was a girl who came into the world quietly and remained quiet. Not the quiet of absence, not the quiet of someone withholding themselves, but the deep, full quiet of someone whose interior life is so rich and complex and satisfying that the exterior has no need to perform. She would sit for long periods in the garden and appear to be doing nothing and be, in fact, doing everything, attending to the world with a completeness of attention that her father recognized with a joy so specific it was almost pain. The joy of seeing yourself in someone else and understanding, for the first time, that the quality you thought was only yours is in fact something that can be passed on, something that will continue past you. The third arrived in autumn, during rain, which felt right, and Akinosuke forgot. This is important to say plainly, without apology or softening. He forgot. Not all at once, not through any failure of will or love or faithfulness to what had been. He forgot the way people forget in the deepest sleep. Gradually, organically, the earlier world not erased, but simply growing more distant, more like something held in peripheral vision than something held directly, until it was less a memory and more like the feeling of a memory, and then less even than that, and then simply gone, the way a dream is gone by mid-morning, leaving only a quality, a residue, a barely there fragrance of itself. He was not troubled by this. He did not register it as loss. He was too present for loss. He was too here, too fully, richly, warmly here, in this palace, in this life, with this woman and these children and this king and this reign. To have any awareness that here was not the only place there was. He was happy. This word happy is one of the most used and least precise in the human language. It covers a vast range of experiences, from the thin, bright happiness of a pleasant surprise to the deep, structural happiness of a life that has found its form. It can mean the happiness of a good meal, or the happiness of a beautiful afternoon, or the happiness of hearing music that reaches you precisely where you live. All of these are real. All of these matter. But the happiness of Akinosuke in those years was none of these things, or it was all of them gathered together and deepened past the point where any single word is adequate, and placed in the chest like something warm and heavy and permanent. It was the happiness that does not announce itself, that does not raise its hand to be noticed, that simply is the way health is, the way warmth is, the way the ground is, present not as an experience, but as a condition, not as something that happens to you, but as what you are when the right things are in place and you are present enough to inhabit them fully. He tended a new garden. It was different from his old one, larger, more complex, with sections he had inherited, and sections he had made his own over time, with plants and arrangements that were of this place and not of the world he had left. But it had the same quality, his garden, the quality of a place where the boundary between cultivation and wildness had been allowed to soften, where the gardener's will and the garden's own will had met and negotiated and arrived at something that neither would have produced alone. He sat in it in the rain, sat in it beneath the particular tree in the corner of the palace garden. Not a camphor tree, not exactly, but something in the same family, something that shared the camphor tree's character of deep, patient, enormous presence, its quality of having been here long before you and planning to remain long after. And he sat against its trunk the way he had sat against his own tree on an afternoon that was now so far behind him it was less a memory than a dream. And he breathed, and the rain fell, and he was home. He did not think of the village. He did not think of the stone path with its gentle curve. He did not think of the gate with its stiff iron latch, or the morning light coming through the screens in long gold rectangles, or the neighbor who left fish at his gate as a gesture of uncomplicated kindness. He was here, only here, entirely here. And here was enough. Here was everything. The years passed the way the best years pass, not slowly, not quickly, but with a rightness of pace that makes the question of speed irrelevant. Each year complete in itself, each season fully inhabited, each ordinary day, and most days are ordinary, and the ordinariness of a day is not a poverty, but a form of abundance, the abundance of the continuous, the reliable, the daily renewed gift of simply being alive in the same place, with the same people doing the same small and essential things. Each ordinary day received with the attention it deserved, which was full attention, which was everything. And this was the life that Akinosuke lived in the folds of sleep, rich and real, and entirely his own. As all lives are entirely one's own, wherever they are lived, as all happiness is real, wherever it is found, the weight of sorrow and the sound of rain, there is a particular cruelty in the way that happiness, once fully inhabited, makes a person vulnerable in a way that unhappiness never could. When a life is difficult, when a person is struggling, navigating hardship, enduring the long, grinding work of getting through, there is a kind of armor that difficulty provides. Not a good armor, not one that anyone would choose, but armor nonetheless. The armor of already knowing that things are hard, of already having calibrated oneself to the weight of the world, of already living with the knowledge that ease is not guaranteed, and that the next hour may ask more of you than the last. A person in difficulty is, in a strange way, prepared. Not for everything, not for the worst, but for the general weather of hardship, which they have learned to read and move through and survive. But a person in happiness, in the deep, structural, fully inhabited happiness that Akinosuke had found in those years in the palace of the king of Tokoyo, such a person has done something else entirely. They have, gradually, and without noticing it, put down the armor. They have opened. They have allowed the world to matter to them at full weight, without the protective distance that suffering sometimes teaches. They have let everything in: the warmth of mornings, the sound of children, the particular quality of an evening with someone beloved, the rain on the garden, the taste of a meal prepared with care. They have let all of it in, fully, without reservation. And in doing so, they have made themselves as vulnerable as it is possible for a human being to be, because all of it can be taken. And when it is, when the thing that has been let fully in is taken, the opening that love made becomes the wound that loss enters through. And the wound is exactly as large as the love was, exactly as deep, exactly as particular. This is not a reason not to love. It is, in fact, the only argument for loving that has ever truly mattered. But it is also the truth that the palace of Tokoyo was about to teach Akinosuke, in the way that only life can teach things, not through instruction, not through warning, but through the simple, brutal, irreversible fact of what happened next. It began in autumn. Autumn in the palace had always been Akinosuke's favorite season, or one of his two favorites. Autumn and the deep heart of summer competed in him, each making its claim through different qualities. Summer through its abundance and heat, and the particular languor of long evenings. Autumn through its precision, its clarifying cool, its habit of making everything more itself by beginning to let things go. He loved the way the garden changed in autumn, the way colors deepened before departing, the way the air acquired that specific sharpness, that edge of cold in the morning that was not yet winter, but was winter's first, distant announcement, still polite, still half-hearted, but unmistakable. He loved the sound of autumn rain, which was different from summer rain. Summer rain was full and generous and slightly indiscriminate, falling everywhere with abundance and warmth. Autumn rain was more specific. It fell with intention. Each drop seemed to know exactly where it was going, and to mean something by going there. It fell on the colored leaves, and made the colors more themselves, the reds deeper, the golds richer, the browns more complex, the way everything in autumn, dampened by rain, becomes more intensely what it is in its final days of being that thing. It was in this season, in this rain, in this most beautiful and specific time of year, that his wife first seemed different. He noticed it the way one notices things that one does not want to notice, obliquely, peripherally, with the particular reluctance of a mind that understands before the heart is ready to understand, and so manages the knowledge carefully, releasing it slowly, giving the heart time to prepare for what is coming. He noticed that she was quieter than usual, not in the way of her natural quiet, the deep and inhabited quiet that was one of the things he loved most about her. Not that. This was a different quiet, a quieter quiet, if that can be said. A quiet with a quality of effort to it, as though maintaining it required something from her that her usual quiet did not require. She moved through the palace with the same grace as always, but the grace had changed its quality slightly. It had become more careful, more considered, as though each movement was being chosen deliberately, rather than flowing from the body's usual ease. As though the body was in a conversation with itself, negotiating, managing, conserving. He asked her one evening, sitting in the garden under the great tree with the autumn rain coming down around them, soft and specific, and cold enough now to see the breath. She was quiet for a long time. The rain said what it always said, everything and nothing, the whole of itself in its sound. Then she turned to look at him, and in her face was something he had never seen there before. Not fear, not exactly, but the close relation of fear that is the acknowledgement of something one cannot change. The acceptance that has not yet finished becoming acceptance. The courage that knows what it is going to need to be, and is gathering itself for the long work of being it. I am not entirely well, she said. 6 words. He would carry those 6 words for the rest of his days, in this palace, and later, far later, beneath a different tree, in a different garden, in a different life. 6 words that rearranged everything that came after them, without yet knowing how. He took her hands, tree above them held them in its patient, enormous shelter. He held her hands and said nothing, because there was nothing that words could do in that moment that the holding could not do better, because some moments are beyond language, not because they are too large for it, but because they are too precise, too specifically themselves, too much the particular texture of this person, and this evening, and this rain, and this cold, and this love, to be translated into anything more general without losing the very thing that makes them real. He held her hands. She let him hold them. They sat together in the autumn rain, and the days that followed were both the longest and the shortest days of his life. The healers came. They were gentle, unhurried people. The healers of this kingdom had that quality, the quality of the kingdom itself, of not rushing against the pace of things, of understanding that care is not the same as urgency, that presence is not the same as intervention, that sometimes the most powerful thing one can do for a person is simply to be there, fully there, without the anxious busyness of someone who cannot bear to be helpless. They came and they tended, and they spoke with honesty and with kindness. The specific, difficult combination of honesty and kindness that is the highest form of both, that refuses to let one compromise the other. What they said was what he had already known in the oblique and managed way he had been knowing things he was not yet ready to know. She was ill. It was the kind of illness that could not be argued with, could not be negotiated with, could not be convinced to reconsider. It was the kind that arrived with its own agenda and followed its own schedule, indifferent to the plans and preferences of the people it visited. She would be cared for. She was being cared for. She would be as comfortable as care could make her. And care in this place was very good. But she would not recover. The word not landed in him like a stone dropped into still water, not with a splash, not with violence, but with a completeness of entry that sent rings outward in every direction, disturbing everything, leaving nothing unchanged. She knew. She had known before he had, or she had known in the way that the body knows things before the mind is told. She had been receiving the knowledge for longer, had been living with it more intimately, had already done some of the work that he was only now beginning. She was not afraid. This was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about her. Extraordinary not because fearlessness is a virtue to be admired from a distance, but because it was so entirely her own, so consistent with who she had always been, that it seemed less like courage than like nature. She was not afraid the way she had never been performing. She was not afraid the way she had always been fully present in whatever was in front of her. The illness was in front of her, and she was present in it, and she brought to it the same quality of attention and acceptance that she had brought to every other thing in her life. She brought to it the gift of herself, He sat with her in the evenings, always in the evenings, when the light changed and the palace grew quieter, and the sounds of the day receded, and what was left was simpler and truer. The lanterns lit, the rain if it was raining, the sound of their children somewhere in the palace, the warmth of the room around them, the warmth of being beside each other, which was, he understood now with a clarity that only the approach of loss can produce. The warmth he had built his life around without ever quite having the words for it. They talked. They talked about the children, each one specifically, in the particular and loving detail of parents who find their children endlessly, specifically remarkable, who could speak of them for hours and not exhaust the subject, because the subject is not a general one, but three entirely distinct and irreducible human beings, each carrying their own mystery, their own luminosity, their own private version of the world that no one else will ever fully see. They talked about the garden, about the rain, about the season they were in, which was moving now toward its most beautiful and most melancholy extreme, the leaves at their most vivid and most briefly so, the cold settling in with more conviction each morning. They talked sometimes about the things that are very difficult to talk about, the things that the ordinary, busy, forward-moving days never quite make space for, because making space for them requires stopping, requires the willingness to sit with what is true without rushing it toward resolution. They talked about what he would do, about the children, about the palace and the garden and the years ahead of him, and what he would carry of her into those years and how. She told him things she wanted him to know. Not dramatic things, not deathbed revelations, or confessions of secret lives, or anything that would have made a more theatrical story. Simple things, the things that mattered to her, what she had loved about the years, what she had found beautiful, what she hoped for the children, not in the ambitious sense, not in the sense of outcomes and achievements, but in the deeper sense. What qualities she hoped would flourish in them, what ways of being in the world she hoped they would find and keep. She told him that she had been happy. She said it the same way he had felt it, without drama, without performance, without the slight exaggeration that people sometimes apply to happiness in retrospect, gilding it beyond what it was. She said it plainly, with the precision of someone who means exactly what they say and has thought carefully about what they mean. She had been happy. This life had been good. This had been worth everything. He believed her, not because he needed to believe it, not to comfort himself, but because it was simply true. He had known it in every one of their years together, in every evening in the garden, and every morning at the table, and every moment of the ordinary, irreplaceable fabric of their shared days. She had been happy. He had seen it. It had been real. She died on a morning in late autumn. The maples outside the palace had reached their most extreme and final red. The the red that comes in the very last days before the leaves let go. When the color has concentrated itself to its absolute essence, when there is nothing left in the leaf but the pure, burning fact of its color. And that color is so vivid, it seems almost to generate its own light, to be lit from within by the last of whatever made it red in the first place. The sky was pale and clear, the particular pale clarity of late autumn mornings when the air has been washed by recent rain, and everything is clean and cold and achingly, heartbreakingly beautiful. She went quietly, with the grace that had characterized everything she had ever done, the grace not of perfection, but of full presence, the grace of someone who is completely in what they are doing, even in this, even in the last and most solitary thing a person does. She was surrounded by those who loved her. The room was warm. The lanterns were lit. The palace outside the room continued its life with the careful, loving quiet of a household that understands that the most important thing it can do right now is to continue, to keep the fires going, to keep the food warm, to keep the daily, ordinary, life-maintaining rhythms of the place steady and present and real. Because the living need the ordinary to hold on to when the extraordinary is happening. Akinosuke was holding her hand when she went. He felt the moment. He could not have described it, not then, not afterward, not ever, with any words that came close to what it actually was. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was the quietest possible thing, the quieting of something that had been moving, the stilling of something that had been alive, the departure of whatever it is that makes a hand the hand of a specific, irreplaceable person rather than simply a hand. He held it for a long time afterward. The room was very still. The pale autumn light moved through the windows slowly. Outside, a leaf let go of its branch and fell, turning once in the cold, clear air, and landed without sound on the wet stone below. The grief came slowly. This is always how it comes, for those who have loved deeply and been loved deeply in return. Not in a wave, not in the sudden, overwhelming flood that the word grief sometimes implies. It comes the way winter comes after autumn, gradually, by degrees, each degree a little colder than the last, until one morning you wake and realize that what you have been moving through for weeks has arrived at something it is no longer possible to call by any other name. It has become winter. It has become grief, and it will be here for a while. And the only thing to do with it is what one does with winter. Not pretend it is something else, not rage at it for being what it is, not try to rush it toward the spring that is, somewhere coming. Simply to be in it, to move through it with the same quality of presence that one brings to every other season. He sat in the garden. He sat in it in the rain, the way he had always sat in it, beneath the great tree, his back against its trunk, his hands in his lap. But But the sitting was different now. The same posture, the same tree, the same rain, everything the same, and everything entirely, irrevocably changed. This is the particular nature of grief after the loss of someone who has been at the center of a life. The world does not change. The garden is still the garden. The rain is still the rain. The lanterns still light the palace windows in the evenings. The children still eat their meals and ask their questions and sleep their long, trusting sleeps. Everything continues with an ordinariness that is, in the first raw weeks, almost unbearable. Not because it is cruel, but because it is innocent, because the world does not know how to grieve and simply goes on being the world. And the person who is grieving must go on being in the world while carrying the enormous, invisible, entirely private weight of what is absent from it. He carried it. He carried it the way he carried everything, with patience, with presence, without the attempt to resolve it before it was ready to be resolved, or to rush it toward the feeling of being over before it had done what it needed to do. He understood, in the deep and wordless way of this place, that grief is not an obstacle to living. It is a form of living. It is what love looks like when the beloved is gone. The same love, the same fullness, the same quality of having let everything in fully and without reservation, simply pointing now at an absence rather than a presence, hurting with the precise, particular, irreducible shape of what is no longer there. The children needed him. They were the ground beneath his feet in those months, not because they rescued him from grief, not because their presence made grief smaller, but because they required of him the daily, practical, sustaining work of being their father. And that requirement was, in its way, a mercy. It gave him somewhere to put his love. It gave him people to tend. It gave him the necessary, grounding routine of ordinary care. The meals, the questions, the small daily dramas of children growing, which are, in the end, not distractions from life, but life itself, the actual texture of it, the actual substance of what the years are made of. He watched them growing with a love that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the way parental love is ordinary, the most common and universal love in the world, felt by every parent who has ever lived, and extraordinary in the way all love is extraordinary when one has understood, through loss, how entirely it might have been otherwise, how the existence of these three particular, specific, irreplaceable people was a series of improbabilities so vast that the only honest response to it was something close to awe. The oldest grew steady and serious, taking on a gravity that was not heaviness, but depth. The depth of someone who has understood early that the world is real, and that real things matter, and that the appropriate response to real things is real attention. He would tend things, this son, gardens, responsibilities, people. He would tend them well. The daughter, the quiet one, the one with the rich interior life, turned her attention in these months toward her father, watching him with the particular careful love of a child who understands more than they should have to understand at their age, who has looked at the adult world and seen its genuine difficulty and chosen, in response, not to turn away, but to move closer. She would sit with him in the garden sometimes, in the rain, saying nothing, just being there, which was, he found, exactly enough. The youngest, the autumn child, was too small for any of this to be fully understood, and so carried it differently, carried it in the body, in the way very small children carry things that are too large for language, in the way they sometimes grow quieter for no reason anyone can name, in the way they sometimes reach for a hand with an urgency that is not fear, but something more like the need to verify. You are here. I am here. This is real. He held that hand whenever it reached for his. The king of Tukoyo grieved in his own way, the way of very old men who have outlived many of those they loved, who have developed, through long and painful practice, a way of carrying loss that does not diminish it, but does, in time, find a place for it that can be borne. He and Akinosuke sat together often in those months, in the amber-lit room where the king had first spoken his daughter's name with such quiet weight, and they were often silent together. The silence between them, the deepened silence of two people who have been through something together that cannot be spoken of directly, but that has changed the quality of everything between them, made it more honest, more necessary, more true. The king was, by then, very old. He had that quality in his final years, of the very last light of a long autumn day, lower, gentler, more golden than any light earlier in the day, illuminating things from an angle that the harsher, more direct light of noon never reached, finding in everything it touched a depth and a warmth that earlier hours could not see. He moved carefully through the palace, attended by those who loved him, conducting his days with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has no more reason to hurry. He spoke less, but meant more. He listened with an attention that had been refined by age and loss and long practice into something very close to the purest form of attention possible. The attention of someone who is no longer listening for what they expect to hear or want to hear, but simply for what is. He passed in winter, in his sleep, in his own room, under his own blankets, with the last of the season's snow falling outside his window in the small hours of the morning, and the palace quiet around him, that deep, middle-of-the-night quiet that is the quietest quiet in the world, the quiet that exists between one day and the next, in the brief interval when even the most wakeful things have finally given themselves to rest. He passed with the expression of a man who had finished something long and good, who had reached the final page of a story that had satisfied him, who had set it down gently and closed his eyes. The palace mourned him the way a place mourns someone who was essential to it, not with drama, not with collapse, but with a subtle, pervasive changing of quality, the way a room changes quality when a particular lamp is extinguished. The light still exists. The room is still lit. Life goes on in the ordinary ways. But something in the quality of what remains is different. Something is missing from it that cannot be replaced because it was specific, because it was exactly itself and nothing else, because it was him, and there is no other him, and there never will be. Akinosuke stood at the old king's grave in the cold winter rain and felt, layered beneath the grief of this particular loss, the wider grief of accumulation, the grief that comes not from one loss, but from the recognition that loss is the grammar of time, that to live long is to love many things and to carry the weight of each departure, and that this weight does not diminish with familiarity, but deepens, because each loss makes all previous losses present again, because grief is not a series of separate rooms, but a single country, and one who has entered it carries, always, the whole geography of it. He stood in the rain and let it fall on him. The palace behind him was lit, amber windows in the winter dark, warm and inhabited, the life of it continuing with the faithful, stubborn, beautiful persistence of life. His children were inside. The fires were burning. The cook was probably, even at this hour, doing something in the kitchen that smelled of warmth and care, and the serious practice of nourishment as love. He stood between these two things, the grave and the lit windows, and felt himself to be what he was, a man in the middle of his life, standing in the rain, holding the dead in one hand and the living in the other, and knowing, with the absolute clarity that grief and love together sometimes produce, that this is what it means to be alive. Not the easy part, not the happy part only. This, the full weight of it, the full, real, irreducible weight of having let everything matter. He turned back toward the light. He walked toward the warmth of the windows, the sound of his children, the smell of the kitchen, the amber glow of the palace that had been his home for more years now than any other place had ever been home. And as he walked, the rain continued to fall around him, steady and patient and unhurried, falling on the grave and on the garden and on the roof and on the stone path and on his face and his hands and his shoulders, falling on all of it at once, making no distinctions, honoring everything it touched. He reached the door. He placed his hand on the warm, dark, well-worn wood of the doorframe. That same warmth, that same deep absorbed presence. And he stood there for a moment, outside the rain, inside the light, and himself on the threshold between them, holding both, belonging to both, unable and unwilling to choose between them, because both were true and both were his, and both were, in their different ways, the same rain falling on the same world that had always been and would always be, both beautiful and heartbreaking, and most beautiful precisely because it was heartbreaking, and most heartbreaking precisely because it was so beautiful. He stepped inside. The door closed softly behind him. The rain fell on, and the man in the yellow robes was somewhere on the road again, walking with his unhurried precision toward the palace that had grown over the years so quiet, coming as he had always been coming, as he had perhaps never stopped coming since the very first bow in the garden, coming to say, in his careful and gentle way, that the time had come, not yet, but coming, the garden again, and the grace of waking. There is a kind of silence that exists only after a long story has finished telling itself, not the silence of emptiness, not the flat, featureless quiet of a room that has never been inhabited, that has never held the weight of voices or laughter or grief, or the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of people living together in a place they have made their own. That silence has nothing in it. It is simply the absence of sound, which is a different thing entirely from what was present in the palace of the king of Tokoyo on the morning that the man in the amber robes appeared for the second time in Akinosuke's life. This silence had everything in it. It was the silence that accumulates over years, that is built layer by layer from all the sounds that have ever filled a place and then ceased. The laughter of children who are now grown and gone to their own lives. The voice of a king who has passed into whatever comes after a very long and very good life. The voice of a woman, that particular voice, with that particular quality of warmth and precision and genuine attention, that had filled these rooms for years, and that was now present only in the way that the fragrance of something persists after the thing itself is gone. Not quite there, not quite absent, haunting the air with its former reality, with the fact of having been. The palace was not empty. Life continued in it, as life continues everywhere, with the faithful and slightly indifferent persistence of a river that goes on flowing whether or not anyone is watching it. The servants were there, the gardeners, the cook, still in the kitchen at first light, still conducting the daily ceremony of nourishment with the same seriousness and love. The children grown now, or mostly grown or growing still, moved through the palace with the particular combination of familiarity and independence that marks the transition from being raised in a place to simply living in it, from being held by a home to holding it in return. But the palace was, nonetheless, quieter than it had been, quieter in the way that places grow quieter when the people who were most essentially themselves within them are gone. when the specific gravity of a specific person, the particular way they inhabited space, the particular weight and warmth they added to the air of any room they entered, is no longer present, and the rooms, without that gravity, feel slightly less anchored to themselves, still beautiful, still inhabited, still warm with the accumulated life of everything that had happened within their walls, but lighter, slightly less solid, the way a very long book feels in the final pages when you know that it is almost over and you are reading more slowly, not because you want to draw it out, but because you want to be present for the ending, because the ending deserves the same quality of attention that the beginning demanded, and that the long middle sustained. Akinosuke had grown old, not suddenly, never suddenly, the aging of a person, whatever it might seem in retrospect. It had happened with the same patient gradualism as everything in this place, the same unwillingness to rush, the same quality of each moment giving itself fully before becoming the next. He had watched it in the mirror of still water in the garden, the hair going, the lines deepening, the face becoming more itself as it became more his age, the way faces do when the superficialities have been worn away, and what remains is purely and unmistakably the person who has been living in that face for 60 or 70 or however many years this had been. He could not say with certainty. He had stopped counting in the way that people stop counting years when they are happy. When time becomes less a measurement and more a texture, less something to be tracked and more something to be inhabited. He was old. He was well. He was, in the particular way of people who have lived fully and lost much and continued loving anyway, profoundly and permanently marked by his life, not damaged, not diminished, but marked. The way a landscape is marked by the weather it has received, the way a piece of well-used wood is marked by the hands that have touched it, the markings not a record of suffering only, but of everything, of joy as much as sorrow, of the specific beauty of specific mornings, of children growing, and a king's slow decline, and a woman's hand growing cool in the autumn rain, and the extraordinary, ordinary, endlessly generous fact of having been alive in this place with these people for all of this time. He sat in the garden. He sat in it the way he had always sat in it, beneath the great tree in the corner, his back against its trunk, his hands resting open in his lap. The tree was, impossibly, even larger than it had been when he first came here. Or perhaps it was simply that he had grown more aware of its size over the years, more attuned to the scale of it, more capable of perceiving its fullness now that he had sat beneath it through enough seasons to understand what it meant to have been here longer than he could imagine, to have held all the weather of all those years in its bark, and its roots, and its spreading, patient canopy. The rain was falling. Of course, the rain was falling. It seemed to Akinosuke, in that quiet and reflective space of very old age, that rain had been the constant of his life here. Not every day, not literally, but in the way that certain things become constants in a life, not through their frequency, but through their meaning, through the way they return at the significant moments, through the way they seem to understand when they are needed and arrive accordingly. The rain had been there on the morning he first arrived. It had been there on the evening he sat with his wife beneath this tree, and she told him in 6 words what was coming. It had been there on the night the king passed. It had been there in the garden through all the years of his children's growing, the years of his own slow aging, the years of sitting and attending and continuing. And it was here now. It fell with the particular quality of autumn rain, that precision, that intention, each drop knowing its destination, each drop meaning something by its falling. It fell on the great tree above him, and the tree received it the way it received everything, without comment, without preference, with the absolute and ancient equanimity of something that has been receiving rain for so long that rain is simply part of what it is, part of its ongoing, unfinished becoming. He breathed the rain-washed air. He thought about his life, not with the urgency of someone trying to understand it before time runs out, not with the anxiety of someone taking stock and finding the accounts unbalanced, with the quality of attention he had brought to everything in his years here, the full, unhurried, genuinely curious attention of someone who finds the thing in front of them interesting simply because it is in front of them, simply because it is real. His life was in front of him now, the whole of it, and it was real. And it interested him the way all real things had always interested him, with the bottomless quality of interest that comes not from complexity alone, but from the knowledge that every real thing contains more than it appears to, that looking longer always yields more, that the ordinary and the extraordinary are not different categories of experience, but different depths of attention applied to the same experience. He had been happy. He had been devastated. He had loved and lost and continued. He had tended a garden and raised children and sat with a dying king and stood at a winter grave in the rain and turned back toward the lit windows and continued. He had lived, in short, a life, not a perfect life, not a life free from grief or loss, or the ordinary daily friction of being a person in a world that does not accommodate persons perfectly, but a real life, a full life, a life that had been worth every moment of its living, including the hardest moments, especially the hardest moments, because the hardest moments were where the reality of it was most undeniable, where the fact of having cared deeply and been cared for deeply was most clearly and most painfully confirmed. He was grateful. This word grateful is used so commonly and so casually that it has nearly lost its weight. But in this moment, sitting beneath the great tree in the autumn rain, Akinosuke felt it with its full weight, which is considerable. Genuine gratitude is one of the heaviest and most beautiful emotions available to a human being. It requires the ability to look clearly at what one has been given, not the selective looking that notices only the good and edits out the difficulty, but the complete looking that sees everything, the joy and the sorrow together, the abundance and the loss together, and says, yes, this, all of it. I would not exchange a moment of this. Even the moments I would have given anything to change, because every moment was mine, was real, was part of the irreplaceable, unrepeatable, entirely specific life that I was somehow given the extraordinary privilege of living. He sat with his gratitude in the rain, and then at the edge of his awareness, not dramatically, not with the theatrical entrance of something trying to be noticed, but simply and quietly, in the way of things that belong to this place, he became aware of a presence on the path. He knew before he looked. He knew the quality of it, the particular, composed, unhurried quality of a presence that does not impose itself, but simply is, that stands in the periphery of one's awareness, like a word one has been looking for, and has just found obvious and right, and somehow always already there. He had felt this quality once before, long ago, or what felt like long ago, in the shifting, non-linear sense of time that this place had always maintained, in his own garden, on his own stone path, in the rain. He turned his head. The man in the amber robes stood on the garden path. He was unchanged. This was the first and most extraordinary thing, the thing that would have startled Akinosuke greatly in the early years of his life here, before he had learned the particular grammar of this place, its indifference to the usual rules of time and change. The messenger was exactly as he had been, small, composed, precise, dressed in those deep amber and golden robes that caught and held the light with their own interior warmth. His hands were folded in his sleeves. His posture was the posture of complete, unhurried ease. His face had the quality Akinosuke remembered, the quality of being most clearly seen when not looked at directly, clear in peripheral vision, softening when approached too directly with the attention. He was looking at Akinosuke, not with the urgency of someone delivering difficult news, not with the slight, unavoidable awkwardness of someone who has been given a task they would rather not have been given, with the same quality of genuine, undemanding, fully present attention that had characterized him from the beginning. The attention of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing, and finding in that exactness a quality of rightness that makes the doing of it peaceful rather than fraught. He bowed. the same bow. Deep, deliberate, full, the bow of genuine and considered respect. The bow that is a philosophical statement rather than a social gesture. The bow that says, I see you, you matter. I am smaller in this moment than my recognition of you. He held it for the same long, waited moment. Then he straightened. Honored guest, he said. The words were the same. The voice was the same. That quality of arriving not because it was projecting itself outward, but because he was receiving it, because the space between them had become the right kind of space, the listening kind. The voice like rain on a wooden roof. The voice that had begun this whole long story and was now, with the same words, the same tone, the same unhurried and respectful precision, bringing it to its completion. Akinosuke looked at him for a long moment. He was not afraid. He had thought sometimes over the years, in the quiet, honest way that very old people sometimes think about the things that are coming, that he might be afraid when this moment arrived, that there might be in him, when the time came, the animal resistance to ending that is part of every living thing, the pulling back, the not yet, the one more season, one more morning, one more cup of tea in the amber lantern light. He had thought he might feel this. He did not feel this. What he felt was something much quieter and much more complete, something that resembled, in its quality of peace and its quality of readiness, the feeling he had had on that afternoon in his own garden, his original garden, the one with the stone path and the stiff iron latch, when he had been sitting against the camphor tree, and the rain had begun, and everything in him had simply released, had let go of its holding, had opened to whatever was next with the trust of a hand that has been carried for a long time and has finally been set gently down. I know, he said. 2 words. But in those 2 words, in the quiet, complete, unfrightened way he said them, was the whole of everything, was all the years, was all the love and all the loss and all the gratitude and all the rain, was the camphor tree in the original garden, and this great tree he was leaning against now, was the stone path and the pale road and the corridor of singing trees and the still lake that reflected the sky more truly than the sky reflected itself, was the princess and the king and the children and the cook and the gardeners and every person who had ever passed through these amber-lit rooms and left their warmth in the walls, was all of it, every moment of all of it, entirely his, entirely real. He rose slowly, with the careful dignity of age, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who knows there is no need to rush, and finds in that knowledge not frustration, but freedom. He rose the way the tree behind him had grown, slowly, over a long time, toward the light, without strain, his hands pressed against the great root, feeling for the last time the particular texture of it, the moss cold and damp from the rain, the ancient bark beneath the moss rough and deeply grooved, root itself arching from the earth with the same geological immensity it had always had, the same quality of having been here long before him and planning to remain after. He stood. The garden was extraordinary. He saw it with the eyes of someone who is seeing something for the last time and knows it, which is, paradoxically, the way one should look at everything, because everything that is seen may be seen for the last time, and the knowledge of this, rather than making sight unbearable, makes it more itself, strips away the habituation, and reveals what was always there beneath it, the specific, unrepeatable, astonishing beauty of the actual garden, with its actual rain falling on its actual leaves, with its actual moss and its actual stones, and the actual amber glow of the palace windows, visible through the actual wet, dark branches of the actual great tree. Everything exactly as it was, everything exactly itself, everything lit from within by the fact of being real. He looked at it all, slowly, with the full, loving, unhurried attention it deserved. Then he turned to the man in the amber robes, who was waiting with his patient, composed, eternal grace, and nodded once. A nod that was its own kind of bow, its own acknowledgement of the rightness of this, of the completeness of it, of the trust he placed in whatever came next, and began to walk. They walked the garden path together. He noticed as they walked the same things he had noticed on that first walk, long ago. The quality of the rain light, the specific precision of each drop, the way the garden received the rain with complete openness, without deflection, letting it touch every surface and darken every stone and deepen every color. He noticed the moss. He noticed the pond with its perfect reflection of the sky. He noticed the flowering things that grew between the paving stones, with the gorgeous, uncomplicated persistence of things that grow where they grow, because it is where they grow, without apology or explanation. He noticed the ants near the base of the great tree, where the roots surfaced from the earth in their arching, geological waves, and the moss grew deepest in the hollows. Near the base of the tree, a colony of ants moved with their characteristic, extraordinary purposefulness between the roots, carrying things many times their size, following roots invisible to any eye but their own, building something whose nature and dimensions and final form were entirely unknown to Akinosuke and entirely known to them, conducting their minute and intricate civilization with the complete seriousness and complete unself-consciousness of creatures, for whom the work is not a choice, but a nature, not an effort, but a being. He stopped walking and looked at them. The man in the amber robes stopped too, with the patience that was his defining quality. The patience of someone for whom stopping is not an interruption, but simply another form of the same unhurried moving, the same complete presence in whatever this moment is. Akinosuke looked at the ants for a long time, long enough for several of them to complete the journey from wherever they were coming from to wherever they were going and return, long enough to see the purposeful complexity of their paths, the way they negotiated each other, gave way to each other, assisted each other with the loads that were almost too heavy, continued without drama and without pause. He thought of kingdoms. He thought of the king of Tokoyo and his amber-lit palace and his palace garden, and the still pond and the pale road through the meadows and the woodland corridor of singing trees. He thought of his own garden, the original garden, the camphor tree, the stone path with the moss growing in every joint. He thought of the village at the edge of the cedar forest. He thought of his neighbor and her fish left at the gate, and the morning light coming through the screens in long gold rectangles. He thought of all the worlds, all the layered, nested, simultaneous worlds that exist within the world, each one complete in itself, each one entire, each one holding within its borders everything that matters to the lives conducted within it. The ants with their roots and their burdens and their civilization beneath the root. He with his garden and his grief and his love and his long amber-lit years. The rain, which had no world of its own, but moved through all of them, touching everything, belonging to everything, making no distinctions. He understood something. He had understood pieces of it before, glimpsed it, in the way one glimpses things in this place, obliquely, in peripheral vision. But now, standing at the base of the great tree with the rain on his face, and the man in the amber robes waiting with infinite patience at his shoulder, and the ants conducting their extraordinary, ordinary lives at his feet, he understood it whole, completely, with the full, clean, irrevocable clarity of a thing finally and entirely seen. Every life is a kingdom. Every life, however brief, however modest, however contained within its borders, is a kingdom in the only sense that matters, complete in itself, real in every detail, inhabited by love and grief and ordinary beauty, and the specific, irreducible weight of being exactly who one is in exactly the time and place one is given. The ants and their civilization beneath the root. Akinosuke and his decades in the palace of Tokoyo. The man sleeping under the camphor tree in the summer rain. In the garden at the edge of the cedar forest. Dreaming a whole kingdom in a single afternoon. All of it real. All of it complete. All of it exactly as large as it needed to be. He breathed. The rain fell on his face, and on the ants, and on the great tree, and on the palace, and on the garden, and on everything. And then, very gently, so gently that it was impossible to say precisely when it happened, because it had no precise moment of happening, because it was less an event than a process, less a crossing than a dissolving, less an ending than a deepening into whatever comes after the deepest possible depth. The garden began to change, not dramatically, not with the theatrical alteration of a dream announcing its ending. It changed the way light changes when the source of it shifts, subtly, pervadingly. The change present everywhere at once and nowhere, with particular emphasis. The amber glow of the palace windows began to soften. The great tree above him began to become, very gradually, something both more and less than it had been, more immense, less specific, more ancient, less particular, as though it were returning to some general treeness from which it had briefly emerged into this specific tree. The rain continued. The rain, as always, continued. The man in the amber robes, Akinosuke, was aware of him still, at the edge of awareness, in that peripheral and precise way, was very still, was perhaps no longer entirely a man in amber robes, was perhaps something more general than that, something that had been a man in amber robes, the way the tree had been this particular tree, for the duration of a specific need, in the service of a specific story, borrowed from some deeper or older or more general reality for the purpose of this. Akinosuke's eyes grew heavy, not with the heaviness of grief or exhaustion, with the heaviness of rest, the particular, welcome, bone-deep heaviness of someone who has been awake for a very long time and has done everything they came to do, and is now, finally, with complete and grateful willingness, ready to sleep. He closed his eyes. The rain was still there. The sound of it on leaves, on stone, on the earth, on everything, was the last thing as it had been the first thing, as it had been everything in between. The same sound, unchanged, unaging. The sound that had been falling on every garden and every kingdom and every life since, before there were ears to receive it. And that would go on falling long after the last ear was gone, faithful to its own nature, patient with its own abundance, asking nothing, giving everything, making no distinctions, honoring everything it touched. He was in the rain. He was the rain. And then Akinosuke opened his eyes. The camphor tree was above him. His camphor tree, the one in his own garden, the one at the edge of his own village, with its deep-grooved bark at his back, and its enormous roots arching from the earth beside him, and its dark, glossy summer leaves filtering the gray pewter light of a summer afternoon overhead. His afternoon, his summer, his garden. The rain was falling. The same rain, of course the same rain. It had always been the same rain, falling on the camphor leaves with that complex, beautiful, multi-textured sound. Each drop its own note, each leaf its own instrument, the whole canopy a piece of music that had been playing since before he arrived, and would go on playing after he was gone. He sat very still, His two friends were nearby, sitting on the garden stones where they had been when he had closed his eyes, their cups of tea beside them, their conversation suspended by the soft interruption of his waking. They looked at him with the mild, friendly curiosity of people who have watched someone fall unexpectedly asleep and are now watching them unexpectedly return. You were only just asleep,